Welcome. It's great to be here. Terrific that so many people could join us today for our webinar on renewable siting. Specifically, the new siting law in New York State is what we're going to be learning about. My name is Betta Broad. I'm the director of New Yorkers for Clean Power, and we are hosting this webinar for USIS, which stands for United Solar Energy Supporters, a community that we're really thrilled to be a part of, and we'll be talking a bit more about later in the call. This is the second webinar that USIS has sponsored, and we have some terrific speakers today who are going to be sharing information about this new renewable energy siting law. Many of us had been saying that the old siting law, Article 10, really takes a very long time to get wind and solar projects built, 5 to 10 years on average. So those of us who are committed to clean energy and meeting our climate and clean energy goals were thrilled when this new siting law was put in place, and now we're all here to learn what that means. So thanks so much to our speakers for being here, and to everybody tuning in at home. This is a tough time for New York and really for the whole world, and I know many people have lost jobs and even lost loved ones, and it's not easy to make the time in the day to prioritize something like this. So thank you for caring about clean energy and for being here today. People can participate actively by putting a question in the Q&A, which is in the middle of the screen at the bottom bar, or into the chat, whichever you prefer. And after each speaker presents, we'll go through the Q&A and make sure that we address people's questions and do our best to follow up if we don't have time for everyone's. But we'll get started now and hopefully cover a lot of ground and get your questions answered. So I will pass it off to my colleague at New Yorkers for Clean Power, Michaela Shavacco, to introduce the speakers.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Betta. Yep, I'm Michaela Shavacco. I'm the program coordinator at New Yorkers for Clean Power. I'm really excited that everyone is tuning in today. And to start us off, we have Mike Bader, who is a business manager at the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers for Local 86, and Harrison Watkins, who's a research director at the New York State Laborers Organizing Fund. To give us a brief introduction on jobs that solar brings to New York State and the different training opportunities that are available. At New Yorkers for Clean Power and at United Solar Energy Supporters, we know it's especially important to learn about green job training and employment as at this time of serious unemployment. So Mike and Harrison will give us a preview of this really important topic, and we'll make sure to do an online teach-in in the future. And so after they start us off, we have Daniel Spitzer, who's an attorney and co-leader of the clean energy practice at Hodgson Russ LLP. Dan will basically summarize the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act that recently passed in New York State that Betta was talking about. And this dictates how large-scale renewable energy projects are cited. And he'll also describe how they're different from the current Article 10 process for permitting and citing large-scale renewable energy projects. And then we have Jennifer Manierre, who is a senior project manager for clean energy siting at NYSERDA, and she'll be going over how local governments can engage in the new permitting process. And this teach-in is recorded and will be posted afterwards, and we'll also make sure to post our speakers' slides. All right, so Mike and Harrison, please start us off with your brief intro to solar jobs and training in New York.
All right, just want to thank everybody for participating today. Not only are these jobs great for the environment, but they also do create jobs for local residents throughout New York State. That's going to be our stress, make sure they're local jobs for our residents. And most of the trades, or all of the trades, I should say, do have apprenticeship and job training programs in place. These are going to augment existing programs that are already out there and funded. Primarily, they're all free to the participants. The local unions pay for it, and the contractors bear the burden of the cost to all the employees. So with the IBW, we're going to focus a lot on not only all aspects of the electrical industry, but solar installation and maintenance, which is going to be ongoing throughout, which creates long-term jobs, and also the battery storage and energy storage components of it, which once again creates more jobs, and it's ongoing. These aren't just jobs, they're careers, they're long-term with benefits and things like that, and they pay a living wage for everybody involved in it. And just a little plug for the IBW, we have a website, We Power America. If somebody went to that, they can log in based on whether they want starting out fresh as an apprentice or have some experience already. Pick which state and which local jurisdiction they want to have reply to them. And I'll try and get that information so we can put that on the website out there. I don't know what Harrison's got. I can always add more.
No, Mike, thank you. Appreciate it. And just to reiterate, my name is Harrison Watkins. I'm the research director for the New York State Laborers Organizing Fund. We represent 40,000 laborers across New York State. And I just want to say, right off the bat that building on what Mike said, we view construction as a career, not just a single job here and there. Oftentimes with any sort of development project like a grid scale solar farm, you'll hear that these jobs are temporary. Well, every construction job is temporary, but we have folks, some of our brothers and sisters that have made a career of building these types of projects. And we think that's vitally important. Similar to what Mike mentioned, we have New York State DOL certified apprenticeship programs, which give people an entryway into the trades, into the laborers for us, and to learn lifelong skills. And that is one key way that folks can get to work on these projects. As Mike mentioned, things at this scale, grid scale renewables, are incredibly important for a variety of reasons. We applaud the state's aggressive goals under the CLCPA, and are looking forward to bringing local residents in, to be a part of that. One of the advantages to using union labor in the trades is that we have members, all throughout New York State. So no matter where the project is located, chances are that we have folks that can go to work in their own backyards, which is a critical part of building community support around these projects. And we've been part of that and working with developer partners and other community partners to get things across the finish line in the state's old approval process under the Article 10. And, we look forward to doing that under the new approval process. And one of the other things that I want to note in terms of green jobs as a whole is that green jobs need to be good jobs, right? And we believe that way is, through making them union jobs. For a just transition to actually happen, labor needs to be seated at the table. And in that respect, very happy to be here, and would like to thank everyone for having me. I think this is an important part of it, community labor getting together to make these things happen. And I also would like to thank NYSERDA and Governor Cuomo for attaching prevailing wage to these RFPs, which is a critical component of getting union jobs at the table. And I'd like to know also that we're strong supporters, the laborers, strong supporters of reforming the Article 10 process, and are excited to see what happens with the new siting process. So again, thanks for having me. And just a reminder, green jobs, but also good jobs. And we look forward to working with our brothers and sisters in the IBW and other trades to train and employ the next generation workers on clean energy projects.
Thank you so much, Harrison and Mike. I really like that line, green jobs and good jobs, because you're right, it's incredibly important that we do both. And I hope that we have both of you on in the future to talk more about this topic, because, right, as I was saying before, employment and job training will be as important as ever now in this Corona era. So I would
now be a good time to mention the webinar Friday, just while we're on the subject.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So speaking of green jobs and good jobs, Friday we're actually hosting another webinar at 1:30 called Workforce Development, a Just Transition to a Renewable Energy Economy. And so for people who are interested in that, we can send out a link in the follow-up email for everyone who registered today, with the recording tomorrow, and hopefully people's slides as well. So if folks are interested in learning more about workforce development and just transition, they can tune in Friday. And then we're planning, as Michaela said, another USIS webinar along these lines to delve more into the job opportunities around these projects in the near future. So more on that soon.
Yeah, thank you. So now I'd like to pass it off to Dan Spitzer to talk a little bit more about the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which was the new law that passed, and how it differs from Article 10.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. I appreciate it. If you get to know me, you'll know that one thing I'm known for is I don't sugarcoat things. So let's talk about Article 10 and let's talk about the new law. One, Article 10 was a failure. In 10 years or so of Article 10, the number of projects that got permitted and built is zero, as in nada. There was one project that started construction, and then our current situation hit and shut it down. It simply was not working in terms of building projects. It also was not working, frankly, in terms of what opponents to projects felt was an appropriate process. And let's talk about number two. Those opponents are not going to be happy with the new law. The goal of the new law is to expedite the process and to streamline the process. And there's the fundamental shift in key phrases within the law is a shift from local values to statewide values. And that's, for those who saw the process as one of home rule, well, home rule is a concept that doesn't really exist in New York, despite what the state constitution says. But you have to understand this new law, and it's still a work in progress. We don't have the rules. We don't have the regulations. We don't know what the standards are. But the roles for municipalities are still there. The roles for the community are still there. So let's bring up parts of it. I'm looking forward to answering questions, but I will fully admit at the beginning that a lot of those questions are not known simply because we don't have rules yet from the state as to what things are going to look like. So hopefully my slides are up and everybody could see them. My firm has been working in renewable energy since literally the first power plants were built in Niagara Falls. We have been working long before it was called renewable energy. And it's interesting to watch the growth in this industry. It certainly has accelerated in recent years. And clearly this law, as it says within its title, is intended to accelerate the growth to meet the goals that the legislature and the governor have adopted and to meet our needs for the future. So let's talk about the law. The highlights of the law is that we have a new section. You may have heard the term Article 23. I still see that even in some emails and in some webinar things. When it was first proposed in the state budget, it was supposed to be a new Article 23. It is not. It is a new Section 94C of the executive law. It creates an office within the Department of State. The reason for the change in name is simply because of the agency that's in charge is DOS instead of the Economic Development Office. The new office is going to be of a centralized uniform permitting regime. It's called the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. That office is going to replace the board, the siting board. That office is going to replace a lot of what went on in procedure-wise. That office is going to create the rules. So what does the law say? It establishes a clean energy resources development and incentive program to be administered by NYSERDA. This is a great opportunity for NYSERDA and municipalities to work together to find key sites and to work together to develop sites. And we could talk about that further, and Jennifer may be covering that also. But it's a really neat program that's in there that basically says to NYSERDA, we want you to take that knowledge and we want you to take it into the communities and create good sites. It directs the DPS to conduct a statewide grid study. Let's figure out where these systems should be, where they can be put in. And a lot of that is addressing the things for those who are grid geeks and dealing with things like capacity issues, congestion issues, the need for frequency control. Where can we best place these things? It also, and this is very important, directs the Public Service Commission to initiate a program to provide host community benefits. Host community benefits exist in every single renewable project in the state. I'm not aware of any renewable energy project where a developer has not offered benefits. This more formalizes things, which is interesting because sometimes we get pushback and they say, oh, it's not legal to have host benefits. There's a number of things in the law that are really nice about this, particularly pointing out that you can now do utility bill credits as one way of doing host communities. We did this a few years ago with the New York Power Authority when they relicensed the plant, the Robert Moses plant. And community people within one particular communities got the benefit of that cheap energy right on their residential electric bills. Now the PSC is going to put that into a wider process. It's also going to expedite the Article 7 transmission siting process. Again, this comes out of frustration from the legislature and the governor with how fast the Article 7 process moves. And so we'll talk about where the key points are. So the permitting procedure is to significantly streamline the process. And what it starts to do, and I'm going to go through these dates, please don't get caught up with the dates. I'm happy to send you my slides. You'll all get my slides. There'll probably be approximately 4 million webinars between now and the date this all goes live. But the dates are in the law are important because they demonstrate how the state has said we're going to speed this up. So you make a determination of completion within 60 days. This was one of the key points that people were concerned about. It was taking the DPS staff and the other agency staffs a long time to determine that applications were complete. Once we have the new rules of what an application should be, they have 60 days to determine whether it's complete. And a complete application requires proof that the applicant consulted municipalities about requirements of local law. Let me say one thing too, as somebody who's been a municipal lawyer for a good part of his career. I was a finance director of a city before I became a lawyer. There is no developer who does not want to consult with municipalities, understand the local law, and make the municipality happy. That doesn't always happen. Communities may be opposed to things. There's usually at least a vocal majority that doesn't want to look at them or has some other reasons why they oppose them. We had one town in the mid part of the state that recently turned down a solar project that would have put $2.5 million worth of investment into the community and a good number of good construction jobs because they didn't believe that they should be supporting something that got tax breaks. They made that political decision that was on a smaller size project. Here, you should understand no developer does not want to consult with the municipality, have a host agreement, understand the road situation, understand the values, and try to comply with the local laws. I'm not going to sit here and pretend there won't be friction between projects and landowners, particularly the neighboring landowners, but understand that that part should be an easy part for everybody to comply with. Here's another important part. The municipality must submit a statement to the Office of Renewable Energy Services indicating whether they believe the project complies with the new law. There's still money in the intervenor money for the municipalities to hire experts to come up with that. But most of you know your local laws. And that's a very important part for developers and municipalities because whether or not you say yay or nay triggers what happens next in terms of certain aspects of the adjudicatory process under the new law. And so there's, again, a great incentive for municipalities and developers to work together. So what's going to happen here is that ORS is going to publish draft permitting commissions for public comments within 60 days of a complete application. And one of the key goals is that we'll have those permit conditions set out in the regs that ORS is going to create. And so unlike the current Article 10 process, which is basically like, here's everything we want to know, then let's draft up bespoke permit conditions. The goal here is to have much more standardized conditions based on the number of proceedings we've had, the number of things that are in commonality, and agree with them. Does that mean the municipality or local community is going to be happy with them? No. And there is a permitting, a public comment process. And one of the things I've already seen a lot of chatter about is the fact that the public comment periods are definitely reduced. That's absolutely true. The two large public comment periods that were in Article 10 law are removed from this process. It was basically a determination by the legislature that those processes were not necessarily gaining anything in terms of value. And indeed, if you look through the comments that were made versus the final conditions, the ones that were concentrated comments that said, what about this, what about this, what about this, generally got adopted into the conditions, whereas the general, things did not. And so focusing that is not necessarily bad for either party. I know there's a lot of opponents to projects out there who will not agree with me on that point, but I would submit that if you look at the record of the public comments, the longer periods of time have not necessarily produced more useful comments in terms of the interest of the localities and the public. If the comments, including those from the municipality, raise substantive, significant issues, then there must be adjudicatory hearings on those issues. That's the typical adjudicatory process under the State Administrative Procedure Act that we're mostly used to in the DEC context, other contexts. Article 10 was sort of an outlier in terms of the wide open process. This brings it back to what we're more used to. And if it doesn't comply with the local law and there's no adjudicatory hearing held, then the DOS must hold a public hearing statement in the affected community. So again, there is public comment. It's the quality and the quantity that has raised a lot of controversy. Within the permitting procedure, a key part is establishing with the various agencies how you're going to do things. So you might have a uniform permit condition that says there will be a setback of X feet from a public road, as opposed to every single different community having its own rules and every single project having arguments about what that number should be. Or as we'll say, these are the permit conditions that are standard for every solar project in the state. These are the standard conditions, and a lot of that has more to do with wind than with solar, but having standard landscaping requirements, having standard setback requirements, having standard procedures for how the storage element is going to be handled. Most projects now are looking at storage, and there are concerns about the safety that can be addressed through uniform conditions. The city of New York has studied that very consistently for years. The state recently adopted updated permit conditions related to storage. That's a key point. And a lot of that, when you adopt uniform conditions, really goes to addressing the concerns that the public has, and it goes to making a more streamlined process. So before uniform conditions are adopted, there must be public hearings throughout the state. That's on the uniform conditions that apply statewide. The site-specific mitigation required if impacts of project cannot be addressed. So you may have a situation where the state says, we're going to have X decibels is going to be our standard of noise from a wind project. But in a specific situation, because of a location, the state may say, no, we're going to have a different standard here. With solar, which has significantly less environmental impacts, we're just now starting to see large-scale solar go through the process. And most of the opposition has been from the folks who live right next door to these projects. They feel it will harm property values. They feel that the visual impact will be of a concern. The site-specific mitigation may relate in that case to landscaping, glare, which is to the extent that's an issue, and some other issues that could come up. So again, there's still that possibility. It hasn't been removed. ORs must make a final determination within 1 year of a complete application or 6 months if it's a priority site, those sites that the state really wants to move on, like moving brownfields back into onto the tax rolls. And all final permits require a host community benefit. That was in Article 10, that's here. And again, I don't know of any project that doesn't have one. But let's focus for a second on that final determination within a year. This is the default procedure, like subdivisions are on the state law. If you don't make a determination, the standard uniform conditions apply. So there's pressure on ORs to get ramped up and get going on applications once it start accepting them. We have a lot of permits currently in the Article 10 process. Article 10 does not go away. The developers can continue within Article 10, or they could switch over. The mechanisms for how that will happen haven't been announced yet. Once it happens, I suspect you'll see the earlier on projects, the ones that have just submitted, say, their public information programs and maybe their scopes, they'll probably switch over because it'll be faster under the new program. Those programs which have already gone through and done most of the adjudicatory hearings or have complete applications under Article 10, they're likely to be completed under Article 10 before the new 94C really even gets up and running. So I wouldn't expect those to switch over. Eventually, though, the Article 10 programs will disappear. and we'll only be dealing with 94C programs. A key difference for people to understand, when this law was first proposed, developers with projects as small as 10 megawatts could choose the 94C route. The law, as it was adopted, left that partially in. So if you have a project now that's between 20 and 25 megawatts, you can choose as a developer to go through the 94C process. Now that's a really easy question. If you're getting along with the community and things are moving smoothly under the local zoning seeker process, you're going to go the local zoning seeker route if you're a 20 to 25 megawatt project. If you're not, if you think you're having problems, if it's not going well, they're going to turn to 94C. It's really going to be that simple. It's really going to be a measure, that extra 5 megawatts of what developers feel, how things are proceeding at the local level. In addition, and NYSERDA is now granted under the law the new Clean Energy Resources and Incentive Program. It's a build-ready program to identify, permit, and transfer sites. The idea is that you have an expert state agency that can go in, work with communities to create shovel-ready sites that then can be bid out to the highest bidder to build the difficult to develop sites are going to get the preference, such as brownfields, for example. But this is really taking the expertise of the state and applying it to solving our problem of siting renewable energy projects. As part of this, NYSERDA is going to be developing an incentive program to provide benefits to property owners and communities that host renewable energy projects. That program could include agreements with property owners to provide pilot agreements, transfer of interest as appropriate. But that was a key part of the law that didn't previously exist, was really focusing on host benefits and incentive benefits to the communities. And there's a wide range of benefits. We have a number of communities in the state that have eliminated local taxes where they have large-scale wind projects. There's one community in the northern part of the state has home to 2 projects. They have no town tax, and once a year they write a check to the county and pay everybody's county tax. They're now getting a 3rd wind project. So some communities, the other benefit, as is mentioned, these projects pay a lot of money in lease money. We have a lot of farms in this state that are still in business because of renewable energy. And if we get cooperation from ag and markets and from the communities, we're going to save a lot more farms. Renewable energy and agriculture is a natural fit. There's a lot of opportunity that the state can take advantage of through these programs. I'm hoping NYSERDA will too through its Build Ready and Incentive Program. NYSERDA has already shown that it's interested in doing that, and I think it's going to be a great leadership. Host Community Benefit Program. It's a little bit confusing as to what it says. Again, as I mentioned, I'm not aware of any project that doesn't have a host community benefit. And some of the aspects of the draft law that didn't make it through were intended to give the state greater control over the amount of the benefits. That has not happened. The Public Service Commission is going to establish a program to provide bill discounts, bill credits, or other benefits to utility customers in a host community. While that's been done, as I mentioned, cooperatively with the utility in one case, in a NYPA licensing that I mentioned, now you can have a formal proceeding where the PSC is going to set out rules that the utilities have to cooperate with to provide host benefits. I get asked this in virtually every project that I've ever worked on in the renewable energy field. Well, where are these electrons going? You know, who's really going to benefit? The reality, of course, is that electrons are fungible in our system, but they get used locally. But the point here is that a specific benefit can now show up in each utility's customer's bill. Those discounts are in addition to any other NYSERDA incentive to property owners and host communities. And while the host community benefit program is lodged within the NYSERDA aspect of this bill and the new law, it really is a proceeding that I expect will codify a lot of what's going on. And you'll see other projects besides NYSERDA projects, as most projects are not going to be NYSERDA projects, follow what this program is in. So pay attention to the PSC proceeding. That also provides opportunities for environmental benefits in terms of offsets. We're seeing more projects go that way. Other highlights for local communities, there's some interesting things to think about. So The law requires a municipality to say, yay, this complies with our law. No, it doesn't. It doesn't say what happens if a municipality doesn't submit a statement. It doesn't deal with the information. The regs are going to have to deal with that and say, if a municipality is given notice and doesn't respond within X time, it's in effect deemed a denial or it's deemed an approval. The regs are going to have to address that. The applicants have to pay fees to a NYSERDA administrative local account for municipalities to participate. There is still intervenor money for both municipalities and for community groups within the process. Again, there's going to have to be regs as to how that's administered. Now, this is the most important part that people have focused on. We had under Article 10 a concept called unreasonably burdensome. If a law was deemed unreasonably burdensome, a local law, the citing board could say it's not going to apply to this project. The law did not apply it at all and to define it so that people knew what it meant. And there were very different versions of what was unreasonably burdensome. And even after a number of cases that have gone through the citing board, we don't really have a clear definition of unreasonably burdensome. If you say that solar facilities are allowed anywhere, but they can only be laid on the ground, that's probably unreasonably burdensome under the old rules. People knew that. And there were a number of towns that passed laws that were close to ban laws, and there was one that was thrown out by the citing board accordingly. But what the new law says is we're not going to look to the local law. We're going to decide if it's unreasonably burdensome in view of the state climate legislation targets and the environmental benefits of the project. That is a very clear statement by the legislature that state values towards clean energy are going to rule over what they seem to believe were NIMBY-type restrictions on clean energy projects moving forward. And that makes it more important for communities and neighbors to work with developers. What unreasonably burdensome means, again, is still somewhat up in the air. Eventually, the rules and the courts are going to have to define it. But there's no question that when I spoke at the beginning about a value swing, that's where it's encompassed. The municipality is otherwise not allowed, as in the current law, to require permits. Zoning does not apply. There's been a lot of misinformation. So just to cover a couple of points, there is no requirement to consult with NYSERDA on pilot amounts. Nothing's happened on the 487. Nothing's changed on tax assessments. The rules that were put into the draft law about setting tax assessments did not make it through. And it is still a local decision on what the amounts of pilots are. If it's under 487, they can be up to the full amount of taxes. It's also assessments are based on what the local assessor comes up with. We're probably going to see a lot of litigation of that because a number of communities have assessed these at fairly high numbers. The courts have not yet said what's the proper methodology for assessing solar and wind projects in the state. We're going to see that in the next few years. But nothing in this law reduced the ability to opt out of 487 or otherwise dealt with the pilots. And that's basically my share. I hope that's helpful. I know I ran through a lot of stuff. It's going to take a long time for us to digest this. There's a lot to learn here. I'm looking forward to the questions and also working with you to answer these questions as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Dan. And yeah, again, if people have questions, we see that they're coming in through the Q&A and the chat. Just we'll try to get to as many as we can after, and also follow up with questions that we don't get to after this. So I'll pass it off to Jen. You just want to
Hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. So I don't think I'm going to have too much more to elaborate on the new siting law. I think Dan did a great job, and honestly, so much of it is still up in the air that I wouldn't even be able to provide much more than he already gave you. But what I will go through is for communities who don't have a solar law in place or maybe have an old one, what you can do to sort of prepare for this development, and not just the large scale projects we've been talking about, but smaller scale solar and battery energy storage as well. So real quick, I think I have about 20 seconds per slide, so it's going to move kind of quickly, but just know that this is like 4 hours of material squeezed into 15 minutes, and we're always happy to do larger sessions for anyone who's interested. Everyone knows that New York has some pretty ambitious energy goals. We're trying to get 100% carbon-free electric system by 2040. So of course, along with that comes a whole lot of large-scale renewable projects that NYSERDA is supporting. This is just a snapshot of what we're planning to support from the 2019 solicitation. 2018 and 2019 looked similar, a similar number of projects, a similar amount of funding behind it. So there's a lot going on. If you haven't seen it in or near your town yet, you're probably going to in the near future. Same is true for those smaller scale solar projects. We got $1 billion behind providing support for those, and also some ambitious goals there, 6 gigawatts by 2025. So for municipalities to prepare for all of this stuff, the Clean Energy Siting team at NYSERDA has developed a Solar Guidebook, and we also offer free technical assistance for local governments. That's what I work on. That technical assistance can range from helping you figure out a payment in lieu of taxes policy. We can help you adopt a law for those, or look at what are reasonable pilot amounts for certain projects, things like that. We have guidance on the seeker process. We have a model solar energy law, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a second. We have some resources for municipalities interested in procuring their own solar, including a model RFP. And finally, with permitting and inspections, we have the Unified Solar Permit, which you can edit as you see fit. And that's a streamlined process for those much smaller systems, like residential size for the most part. And just generally, we can provide technical consulting services to the extent we're able. And everything that I'm going to be presenting here today and more details, full guidebooks and resources are all available on our website right here, nyserda.ny.gov/siting. You can also find our contact information there. If you forget the URL, just Google Clean Energy Siting NYSERDA and it usually pops right up. So like I mentioned, our team had developed this Solar Guidebook. It has a whole lot of chapters. We're clearly not going to go through all of them. It's been developed over like 2 or 3 years or so. It's pretty thick, if you can see that. There's a lot of good stuff in there, which is why we can't cover it all today. But if there's a PDF on the website, and we're always happy to mail out hard copies for folks who would like that as well. So one of the most important tools I think a community would have, if they don't already, is adopting a model solar energy law. Like Dan was saying, the new siting process can overrule local law if it's unduly burdensome, but it's still important to have one on the books so that you have at least something to point to. Otherwise, you have essentially no say. It's not going to be unreasonably burdensome if you have no law. So it's good to have something reasonable in place. And we think that our model is pretty good and reasonable. I can't say whether or not it will actually align with the new regs. We may need to make some edits at some point over the next year, but that's to be determined. And also, like I was mentioning before, it's not just these large scale projects. You also want to be have some great laws on the books for managing how residential and anything under 20 megawatts is developed in town too. So it's all inclusive. My old boss used to joke that if you could find one aspect of managing solar in your community that's not covered in the model law, that he would buy you dinner. I don't know that I'm willing to make that offer on a webinar of like 100 people right now, but we're pretty confident that it's covering everything. And there's a Word version of it available. You're more than welcome to edit anything in there as you see fit. We just tried to save you a little bit of time and put a template together with some reasonable suggestions in it. These are all the sections of the law. I am certainly not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to pull out a couple key highlights of things that I think are important. And again, you can always reach back out for more information in the future. So we divided it up into 3 tiers of solar systems. The first one being anything that's attached to a building, be it on the roof or the side or whatever. They go through sort of a streamlined review process. No one's too offended by those. So the smaller ones that are attached to a building. Tier 2, any smaller system designed for on-site use, but it's going to maybe ground mounted in someone's side yard or something. They have an additional layer of protection and some more stringent requirements for them in the law. And then finally, tier 3, which I think is what most folks are interested in today, those larger utility scale solar systems. They have absolutely the most stringent requirements to meet in the law and take up a vast majority of the pages that are in there. Just for a little bit of scale, this is what a roof-mounted solar energy system might look like. It doesn't really depend what size it is. It could be on a house or on a big box building like that. It's still tier 1 because it's attached to a building. Just another shot there. And this is an example of a building integrated where it's actually not on the roof, but still attached to the building. Tier 2, again, what you might see in someone's side yard, designed for on-site use. And then finally, Tier 3, those really large utility scale systems. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that brownfields, landfills, and repurposed lands are great spots to host solar. And those are exactly the kinds of places that NYSERDA is going to be looking to for the new Build Ready initiative. So just a few snapshots of different things that are in the law that I think are very important and that most communities would be concerned about when permitting solar. For those smaller systems, you want to make sure that on a pitched roof that the panels are installed perfectly parallel to the roof and not raised up too high. On a flat roof, they're hidden behind a parapet, they don't extend above it. For the Tier 2 systems, and some of these apply to all, like glare, for example, no matter what size it is, the panel should always have an anti-reflective coating. Screening and visibility, you want to try to minimize from adjacent properties the view to the extent possible. And for Tier 2, we just recommend complying with the underlying lot size requirement. And probably one of the most important things, other than shielding the view from your neighbors to the extent possible, is the height for these systems. So there are a couple options in the law. You can either make them subject to what you already have on the books for maximum height for accessory structures, or throughout the law, you'll notice we have the charts like this one right here where we make suggestions for something that you could adopt that is specifically for solar. Now, of course, you don't have to take those suggestions. You could change the height in residential to 12 feet or even 8 feet if you so choose, but we laid out what we think are reasonable based on what we've seen out there. And now for Tier 3, those really large projects, all of these sections, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you'll see if you look down the list, it's pretty much covering most things that a community would be concerned about. And if you have this law in place, they will need to abide by these rules. Okay, so a couple examples. So lot size, this is another one of those things in the law where you can kind of choose between different options, either reference the underlying zoning district, or in the chart, we have some suggestions for different zoning districts that you might want to adopt, again, that we think are reasonable, but you're more than welcome to change them. And the same is true for regulating the height of those systems, different heights in different districts. Setbacks, this tends to be another somewhat contentious issue with some of these projects. Having really extreme setbacks, you're probably not going to have a good argument that the project doesn't meet local law through the current Article 10 process or the new one. So we've outlined here some setbacks for different zones that we think are reasonable. Again, you're free to change them. So that's in there. Screening and visibility, another major concern that a lot of communities have with these things. So we've outlined some suggestions here. So for the smaller projects, you want to try to minimize the view. For the larger projects, you also want to try to minimize the view, but do it in a more sort of thorough way, possibly even through seeker. It's important also in the law, there's a section on agricultural resource protection, which I know all of these things are concerns to communities, but this one in particular too. So you can include things in there to help protect your farmland, perhaps requiring pollinator plants to be planted under. It's also possible to have projects ready to have sheep grazing under them. That tends to work out really well, and I think it's getting more popular lately, so it's sort of a win-win. Not only are you hosting solar and generating energy, but you're also keeping your farmland useful. So it's twice as beneficial. For those who are not familiar with New York State Real Property Tax Law 487, it basically gives a 15-year property tax exemption to any renewable energy project in the state by default. However, municipalities can opt out of 487 and just fully tax projects. We don't necessarily recommend that because it generally ends up being cost prohibitive and then the project won't be able to get built. But if you do not opt out and you remain just the default of the tax break on 487, you do have the opportunity as the local government to negotiate a pilot agreement with the project. So it's also important that as soon as you hear that a developer is interested in putting a project in your town, the second they give you that notice, if you do intend on negotiating a pilot agreement, let them know right away there is a time frame. And again, this is something we can help with. I touched on it briefly earlier. In that guidebook, we have a model pilot law. It's in addition to the model solar law. It's sort of a separate thing where you can address pilot and perhaps outline some default values depending on the project size. We have a model pilot agreement calculator to help you determine what a reasonable pilot rate might be. Right now, the pilot calculator that we have on our website is intended for slightly smaller projects. I think it goes up to approximately 2 megawatts or so. It should do a decent job for those. We're working on getting a pilot calculator out there for the larger projects, hopefully in the very near future. It's pretty close to done. And similarly, we have a property tax calculator for these projects too. Either for communities who opted out of 487 could use it, but also after that exemption expires at year 15, you'll need to have some sort of assessment on the project. Like I mentioned before, we also have resources for municipal procurement. It includes a template RFP, template lease agreement, and a model solar law for counties. Again, this is like 4 hours of information in 15 minutes, so please excuse the high level of it. All right, so lastly, I just want to touch on battery energy storage systems real quick, because with all of the renewable energy generation that's going in, they're intermittent sources and they're not going to be producing energy at all times right when we need it. So battery energy storage is going to be very important to making sure that this renewable energy development is successful. It serves a lot of purposes, not just providing us solar energy when the sun's not shining. It can also help reduce peak demand on the grid. It can also help reduce peak demand charges for individual buildings. It can provide emergency backup generation. It can help replace gas peaker plants and even possibly do a better job at that, because you can see on this slide, gas peakers, and these are the plants that only fire up periodically when the grid has the most energy being demanded from it. So a hot summer afternoon when all the offices and all the homes have their air conditioners going at full blast, you have to fire up these extra generation plants, right? And so they tend to be natural gas. They only operate at 80% of their capacity. They take a few minutes to even ramp up. They have emissions. Energy storage, battery energy storage, on the other hand, can not only provide electricity into the grid to help meet that peak demand. When there's too much electricity on the grid, it can pull it off and store it for future use. So that's where we get 200% capacity for that. They fire up in seconds because they're not firing, just flip the switch on the battery, and they don't have emissions. So for all these reasons, we're going to be seeing a lot more batteries coming in, and we want to help local governments get prepared to permit them and know what they're doing. NYSERDA is providing a lot of support behind energy storage, much like we are for solar and wind. We have $400 million available in incentives for energy storage. We have some pretty ambitious targets, 3,000 megawatts of energy storage online by the year 2030. That's about, I think, 40% of the demand of all homes in New York State, for some scale. And much like we do for solar, the Clean Energy Siting team at NYSERDA will provide technical assistance with helping local governments to understand this stuff. The Battery Energy Storage Guidebook was developed a little over a year ago or so. We put out the first version. It's a little bit thinner than the Solar Guidebook. We hope to keep adding to it as we learn more about this technology and are able to develop resources that maybe local governments tell us they need. So feel free to reach out. Right now it has 4 chapters. Model law, much like the model law we have for solar, but it's focused on battery stuff. We have a model permit, again, similar to that unified solar permit. It's intended to provide a streamlined process for those smaller battery systems, residential, small commercial. There's an inspection checklist for the code official doing electrical inspections. And then chapter 4, which is right now the 2019 Energy Storage System Supplement that was adopted last year. New York as an emergency rule, adopted a new, very stringent fire code based on the 2021 International Fire Code for energy storage systems. It has since been incorporated into the 2020 Uniform Code. So that's great. We'll probably replace Chapter 4 with the full version of the Uniform Code, but right now it's still the 2019 Energy Storage System Supplement, but not many of the requirements have changed, so it's still a useful reference, I think. Again, all this information is available on our homepage, including our contact info. Sort of like I was describing earlier, you might find that folks are applying for energy storage permits, like on a large scale project that's on the utility side of the meter, providing some of those grid services, helping the grid meet peak demand, things like that. Or behind the meter on the customer side, there might be a battery system serving an individual building. All of these systems are going to have a battery management system that monitors individual cells. It will send alarms to an offsite location if something goes wrong. And when something does go wrong, these battery management systems have the ability to isolate whatever that problem is and shut it down so that it doesn't get bigger and cause a problem. What kind of problems might that be? The major concern that folks have with battery energy storage systems tends to be fire, and in some cases, the potential for explosion if the overheated batteries are off-gassing and accumulating those gases in a confined space. While these things are certainly possible, I did mention that New York State has the most stringent fire code in the country right now. And if you look at the top of this diagram and just sort of work your way around clockwise, all of these things are in place to make sure that those fires and or explosions don't happen. And pretty much as you work your way around this diagram, it's almost like walking through the new fire code. All of these safety precautions that need to be in place for these systems when they're installed. I already talked about that. And if you're interested in downloading the newest version of the 2020 Fire Code that has formally incorporated all those new fire safety requirements for energy storage, you can find it here. Like I've alluded to, we have a model law for battery energy storage. It has a lot of the same sections that the solar law does. Again, not going to go through them all. We divide the battery systems into two tiers. Tier 1 being anything under 600 kilowatt hours. That might be one of your like slightly larger commercial systems.
Jen, so sorry to break in, but I did want to mention that we're actually having a focused battery storage webinar in a couple of weeks. So if maybe this part you could just wrap up so we have time for questions about the siting law, that would be great.
Yep.
We have a lot of questions we want to get to, and we want them to be focused mostly on the siting law for today, but people should definitely stay tuned for May 12th, which is when we're having an energy storage specific webinar. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Very good. Yep, fly through them. So divided into tiers, different requirements depending on the size. The smaller ones are easier to get through. The larger ones have to do special use permit, etc. A couple pictures of the smaller ones, a couple pictures of the bigger ones, and questions.
Okay, great. Tons of information there. Thank you so much, and great to know all of the support that NYSERDA can provide. At this point, we have 4 minutes left in our timed webinar here, but if Dan and Jen are willing to stay an additional 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, I'm available as long as people need.
Oh, that's a dangerous offer, Dan.
Well,
we have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
But,
a lot of the questions were the same, though. I noticed there were questions about the size of the projects. Anything over 25 megawatts is 94C now. If it's 20 to 25, it's up to the developer. It could either be the local control or it could be a 94C project. Another question was about, were the regs about non-energy producing. The regs don't exist yet, but this law is only about electric generating projects, renewable energy generating. It has nothing to do with the non-electric generating heat conducting solar that the person asked about. There was also, I think, a question about when the regs would be promulgated. As soon as possible. You have an office that doesn't yet exist, yet nevertheless, there are people in the state who are currently working on the draft regs. And they're supposed to be out within a few months. The state is pushing it as fast as they can. Obviously, the state is shut down also, but there's no, anybody who gives you a specific date now, I think, is just guessing. There's a timeline, but there is no specific date. Lastly, there was a couple of comments about agriculture, and particularly there was a kind of a comment that NYSERDA was not helping with agriculture. With due respect, agriculture has got a real friend in NYSERDA. As to whether you have a friend in ag and markets, that's a different question. Frankly, NYSERDA has been great to work with on agricultural projects. They've supported farmers. They've, in a lot of ways, as I mentioned earlier, agriculture and renewables make sense. Ag and markets has been, to put it bluntly, more interested in protecting soils than it has been in protecting farmers. We disagree on some of their construction techniques. We reached a settlement, but now they're starting to require mitigation dollars, which we don't even believe they have a legal right to require, that is frankly killing projects. They have not stepped up to support farmers who want to build solar in a way that would maintain farming on the property. So I think the state has a way to go, but I would tell you NYSERDA has been a great, in my opinion, partner of agriculture. And I can answer more specific questions about agriculture if people have any.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So we will ask a few questions that came in from the chat and Q&A. I don't know if you already touched on some of this, I'm sure you did, but what happens if municipalities do not have local laws dealing with renewable energy siting? What if they are currently under a moratorium while developing their local law? How might ORS address that?
There was a situation under Article 10 where there was a town under a moratorium. The siting board said moratoriums hold things in place, therefore we look at the law prior to the moratorium. There was also an argument in that case of what happens if a town changes the law. If the town changed the law before the record closed, then they looked at the law. If the town changed the law after the record closed, they did not look at the new law. So a moratorium itself just freezes things in place. If you don't have a law and you do a moratorium, then you don't have a law. How ORS will handle that, whether they have specific regulations to deal with that situation, which has now come up in a couple of cases, I don't know. But that's the general rules, is that you should work, as Jennifer has said, to use the toolkit and get a law in place. Certainly as soon as you know that a large-scale project, and large-scale projects, remember, still take at least 6 months to go through. They're not, hi, here we are, we're building tomorrow. So you certainly have plenty of time to do a local law, including significant public comment. And Jennifer's given you the tools to do that.
Speaking of the clock, you know, some people are concerned about the limitation of having, you know, the 1 year or 6 month clock. You know, how would you suggest that communities address that if they feel that they need more time?
If you need more time, unless it's an agreement between the agency and the applicant and the municipality, there is no mechanism for more time. It's the shot clock was one of the very specific things that the legislature has commanded as part of the process. So if you feel you need more time, you need to work with the developer, because certainly in every other process in the state of New York, if an applicant and an agency mutually agree to extend the time, you can. Otherwise, there is no right to extend the period of time. And that's why working with Jennifer and the tools that she's presented now, or as soon as you know about a project, is important.
Okay, and if a current solar project is 25 megawatts or under and is under Article 10 and hasn't been approved yet, and the application hasn't been filed, does it now proceed under the new law, or can it still proceed under Article 10?
It can still proceed under Article 10 if it's more than 25 megawatts. Article 10 only allows a 25 megawatts and over. So if you have a project that you would have submitted an application tomorrow, Article 10 is still open. What we expect to happen with the new rules is that when the door is open to accept applications, the applications are going to have to mirror Article 10 until we have new regulations on what the applications are. So for right now, you could certainly still submit an Article 10 application until we have somewhere else to send them.
If a local IDA establishes a pilot program for solar projects and wants to provide a developer a pilot within a municipality that has opted out of 487, which pilot prevails?
There's two mutually exclusive silos for tax exemptions. The IDA exemption doesn't matter whether you've opted out or not. 487 is one mechanism, IDA is the other mechanism. So the opt-out only applies to 487. Let me echo something that Jennifer said about 487. Opting out gets you no benefit. If you don't like a project, you can require a pilot up to full taxes. But every farmer who's put a windmill in his back on the farm, or every homeowner who wants to put solar on their house has just lost an exemption if you opt out. It's completely unnecessary. However, 487 and IDAs, totally different silos, so opt-outs are irrelevant to IDA decisions whether or not to grant a pilot.
All right. Will the pilot calculator for larger projects that NYSERDA is developing specifically address arrays that produce for wholesale market? If so, will it use the same approach of discounted cash flow as the current calculator?
I'm not sure about the first part, to be honest. It's one of my colleagues that gets into the nitty gritty of it. But for the second part of the question, and feel free to reach out and I can get you answers after this. Shoot an email over cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov. But for the second half, it's my understanding that we would, yes, be using discounted cash flow in the model. I hope that's enough.
A question about Article 10 does not really apply to offshore wind projects that are located in federal waters, but Article 7 is more relevant for offshore wind projects. Can you describe more specifics of the Article 7 changes, focusing especially on the NYSERDA projects, please, and thank you.
Not really. I can send you some stuff that we have on it. I don't think that the PSC has been directed to expedite the process. I defer to Jennifer if she's seen anything differently. I don't think we know yet what that expedited process is going to be. There's some general things. There's some stuff in my slides when I send them out that talk about Article 7, but I think it's a bit early to make too many comments on what the new process is until the PSC basically says what it is. But clearly part of the goal was to service the state's offshore wind by reducing the length of time that Article 7 process takes. Although, to be fair, those projects, they're really being held up at the federal level, not at the state level.
This question is about prevailing wage. If there is no enforcement, payroll inspection procedures, this will not work. To whom can anonymous questions be raised to get an installation inspected for paying prevailing wage?
Jennifer, unless NYSERDA does it, I assume DOL would be the appropriate agency whenever there's a state prevailing wage requirement.
That would be my assumption as well. I'm not sure.
Generally, when my clients get contacted, and I'm not aware of anybody in the industry who's not aware that NYSERDA requires prevailing wage, but generally, and I defer to Mike if he knows differently, but it's generally DOL that you go to.
Yeah, that's usually the case in NYSERDA, and we do small scale projects.
Mike, it's kind of hard to hear you.
Oh,
Volume's
usually
too
the
low.
Department of Labor also, they do deem those jobs prevailing wage. We work with those when we have questions whether they're prevailing wages or not.
Still hard to hear you.
All right. Better?
Yes.
No? Okay. So Department of Labor, usually we work with them when we're working to see where prevailing wages, if they're dictated or not on particular jobs. But we also do other smaller scale jobs that aren't prevailing wages with our workforce as well. It's just particular wage determination is set by the Department of Labor.
Okay, and we will be getting more into workforce on a future webinar. And just to answer, a couple of people asked about whether they'll be able to rewatch this because there was so much great content. And yes, we will be sharing a recording with everyone who registered, and we'll have the video also posted on YouTube. And you can find out more on our website, nyforcleanpower.org, as well as usysny.org. That's United Solar Energy Supporters, a new community to work to advance utility scale and community solar projects in New York State. But we have a couple more questions. This one, Jen, if you could touch on, how can New York State government, either NYSERDA or municipalities, help facilitate solar grazing and other agri-voltaics? Would something like the Mass Smart programs, upfront and ongoing incentives be feasible here? Is anything happening to that effect? I know there's also an issue about tax exemption when it comes to co-locating solar and ag. So I'd love to hear if you have some ideas on that, or if there's something in the works already at NYSERDA.
I don't really have any great revolutionary ideas, but I have heard all of these things before. So it is something we want to continue thinking about. Perhaps some incentives would be great. That's definitely not something I'm going to promise right now, especially on a webinar, recorded webinar. But I would say is the best we can do right now is maybe put requirements and perhaps some incentive type things into the local law. I don't really have a great answer other than that right now. But whoever is asking those questions, if they have some ideas, please reach out, because I'm more than happy to start thinking more deeply about that stuff and developing resources around it.
Okay, great. Should we wrap up, Bella, or you think that we should do one more? There are a lot of questions, and we can definitely follow up after the webinar. So apologies if we didn't get to yours today, but we will send out answers afterwards, as well as the recording and the slides. As Betta said.
Yeah, maybe we can wrap up with one last question. If folks know the answer, will the pilot calculator for larger projects that NYSERDA is developing specifically address arrays that produce for the wholesale market? If so, will it use the same approach of discounted cash flow as the current calculator?
We already addressed that one.
You did, okay. All right then, well, I guess we are at time anyway. It's 10 past. Really appreciate everybody sharing their expertise. And as Michaela said, we will copy these questions into a doc and get some answers if we haven't already touched on them, and share the slides and recording in an email, as well as the other webinar that I mentioned, the workforce development webinar we're doing Friday, and the storage one that we're doing on May 12th. So I think that's it. And also hopefully Mike will be joining us again to talk more about jobs, job opportunities, and Harrison to talk about more workforce development associated with these projects. So lots coming up, and we'll look forward to continuing to build support for solar and renewable energy in New York State with you all. And please feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions or concerns, or more about how to get involved. Thanks so much, everybody. Be well.